Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. This is Dr. Andrew Rimby, joined with Mary DiPipi. Hi, Mary.
Hello, everyone.
I said to Mary, I wanted to release a year in review episode because we are technically on a 2 week break, but when I saw her in South Jersey in a really cute town called Haddonfield. We had coffee. She met my boyfriend. And I said, you know what, Mary, let's just jump on a podcast episode because we wanted to wish you all a happy new year. It's almost 2024, so we have a few days. And I wanted to just recap with you, Mary, some of the highlights of 2023 because we had so much
hmm
in the Ivory Tower Boiler Room.
Oh my gosh, I know. It is insane sometimes when I look back, like from the year and just be like, oh, so that's how many episodes I did this year. Like, insane. Insane.
Exactly. And Mary and I are about to go to Philadelphia. So on January 5th, we are going to the Modern Language Association, one of the largest, it is the largest English and literary studies conferences. So I can't wait for us to be representing Ivory Tower Boiler Room, talking about LGBTQ plus voices and true crime and TV and film culture and analyses and how it connects with the university because all of this came from when I was a PhD student at Stony Brook, and I
Mhm.
won a fellowship from Public Humanities New York and decided to, during the pandemic, pivot into the podcast space. So that's why we're here today. It's been more than 3 years, three and a half
Mhm.
years. Um, so that's that journey. And I can't wait because we're going to be giving out our bookmarks and Mary's going to, be right there by my side. And it means so
Mhm.
much to me. So if you're going to be at MLA, make sure you stop in the Digital Innovation Room on Friday between 9 to 12. We'll be there
Mhm.
in the Philly Convention Center, which is a great place. And I don't think I've ever actually been in it. So
Me
uh,
either.
I know. So we're gonna have, and we live right by Philly. So it's easy for us. And I do want to make an announcement, which is Mary knows, but I really have loved Long Island. I've been there for 9 years. And I feel like that chapter's come to an end just because I get to be virtual, which is beautiful. Um, and once you start working from home and you're not around your friends and family, which I have a lot of friends there. So, I know who you are. There's a lot of friends, but when you're not by your family, it does make it tough knowing that it's a 3.5 hour trip and it's always like a vacation or you have to try to plan it. And I love the Philly area and I love being in Jersey between Philly and New York City and the shore. So I think I'm moving back to South Jersey. I'll keep everyone posted. And I know Mary is excited probably that I'll get to see her more.
Mhm.
Mm. So
Oh, of
that's some big
course.
news. But for those of you who are on Long Island, don't worry, I'm not moving right away. So I think this is going to be my last summer on the island. So we're going to have to make it a smash. And I will always be back on Long Island couch surfing because I'll get to consult with businesses there. So, you know, I know Long Island now really well, the way, Mary told me. She's like, Andrew, you know where to go. You're going to be
Mhm.
okay. Um, so I think what I want to talk about first, Mary, is you had some really exciting episodes
Mhm.
about well, I mean, you had really intense episodes as you do in true crime and academia.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, but I know you had a few that were multiple parts. So you had the Virginia Tech shooting, which was really
Yes, which is so
insightful.
unfortunately, yeah, still so timely in this country, I feel like everyone said when Columbine happened like we weren't going to do this again, and then Virginia Tech happened and Sandy Hook, and I'm sure I'm missing, a bunch in between, but it's, unfortunately it is still a very relevant topic and a relevant and occurring problem still in this country. And we're basically like the only country with this, like the problem to this severity. And, it's just frustrating because lawmakers on both sides are refusing to really do what they need to do on their end as far as gun laws and mental health are concerned. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was an episode that I had done on the blog back when this was a blog. And I had been holding it and holding it and holding it. And when we aired it a few months ago, it just was the right time. So, yeah.
And it's very timely, like you said, unfortunately, but um, there are issues in this country that everyone keeps yelling fire in a crowded room, and
Mhm.
those who are in power and privilege and position to do change and advocacy are bought out by companies that are supporting this infrastructure. And
Mhm.
it's just like the student debt crisis. It's just like
Mhm.
housing crisis and inflation and big money in politics and us not having candidates we want. I mean, if we
I
could
know.
just,
The list goes on and on and on and on.
I know, and everyone knows the problems, and the majority of Americans all agree on solutions, but yet
There's no
it's
one
not
in, yeah.
beneficial to those in power.
Mhm.
Mm.
Because they're extra
So
money that they shouldn't be making wouldn't be funneling in their pockets if they weren't. It always
mhm,
comes down to money at the end. I mean, this is why they say money is the root of all evil,
that's true. Well,
even though it
I'm so
shouldn't be, but it's become that way.
yeah, well, and I'm so glad that you did this episode, like the
Thank you.
series, but also, you know, you had on I think it was 2023. It might have been a little late earlier, which is okay, right? Everyone can search our catalog. But Dr. Lena Haji and Dr. John Delator.
Yeah, I think that was March, April of this year, actually. Yeah, so this
Yes.
was this year. Hmm.
And do you want to let everyone know like what that conversation was about? Because it was really exciting to like hear this forensic analysis and
Hmm.
discovery because, right, Dr. John Delator is a forensic
Both
scientist.
of them are.
Both of
Both
them. Okay.
Dr. Lena Haji and Dr. John Delatour are both forensic psychologists who actually work in like completely different areas in some respects. So Dr. Lena Haji is mainly in the prison system as a psychologist, psychiatrist. So she works with inmates who are already been prosecuted, whereas Dr. John Delatour does more of guest spots on like court TV and things like that, where he will break down certain aspects of the evidence that's presented depending on what case they're talking about. And I think does more of like the pre-court um,
Hmm.
analysis. So that's one of the. I mean, again, I think both dabble in those same things, but it's just mainly that's what each of them do. And we basically got to talk about how forensic psychology works in the courtroom, how it works in the criminal justice system, but also in the ways that people don't realize. So, for example, like some people wouldn't think that a forensic psychologist would be what Dr. Lena Haji does, which is working in the prison system. I think a lot of people would just assume that that's a regular psychologist. I mean, that was my assumption
Yeah.
beforehand, just like with any doctor, like how they have a medical doctor and nursing staff on the payroll, obviously, in case anything goes wrong. But again, like you wouldn't call that a forensic doctor, because they work in
Yes,
a prison
yes.
system. Um, so yeah, so also we got to talk about um different ways that certain perpetrators, especially those of the sexual nature, how they have to, which is fascinating and disturbing and all of the things. So I'm just gonna put my blanket trigger warning out now. Because like I said, we do discuss what it's like for them to work with these people. And there is a clip that I think is circulating on my Instagram somewhere of
Yes.
Dr. John Delatour talking about how you basically have to put yourself in their mindset because you're not going to get any information that's relevant to the case or relevant at all, period, unless you get them to trust you. So you can't just go in being like, well, you committed this horrific act. Like, it's terrible. You can't point out the fact that they're wrong. You have to get in line with their line of thinking and try
Yes.
to understand it from their point of view, which, as he said, can be a very like tricky thing, and it's not always comfortable, but it's what has to be done in order to get the information that's needed. So
Exactly. Well, and just in case when you're watching this video, you're like seeing me turn around, I'm getting my phone because um I'm looking up on Spotify our catalog, and like not only did you have Dr. Lena Haji and Dr. John Delator. I always say
mm-hmm.
Delator, but tomato tomato that something that reminds me of that conversation was when you had Dr. Mack on. And if people
Mm-hmm.
haven't listened to Dr. Mack, the reason I'm bringing these specific guests on, Mary, is because it seems like you might have them back on again in 2024 for cult thinking or,
Yes, there
falling
might
into
yeah, there is
Scientology.
something in the works. So
Something in the works is happening.
yeah.
So like Dr. Mack, what was happening with her revealing the ivory tower?
So Dr. Mack is a psychologist. I don't believe that she's a forensic psychologist. I think she's just a regular psychologist, psychiatrist. And which I'm not saying that interchangeably. I just don't remember if she's one or the other. Because psychiatrists prescribe medicine, psychologists can't. So there is a difference
Yes.
between those two. I just didn't want anyone out there thinking that I'm using them interchangeably. I just don't remember. Um, but she mostly discussed her trauma in academia and the struggles that it took for her to get her PhD in psychology, and just really looking at the fact that she's learning psychology while also like all of this other psychological trauma is going on around her. So I can't even imagine what that must be like, because yeah, I remember when I wanted to go for psychology and the first thing they said was don't try and diagnose yourself. Which is the
Yes.
hardest thing, and I can't even imagine like going through the things that she went through. Check out that episode so you can find out more. Um,
And it's about
but then also
gaslighting
learning at the same time.
and gaslighting a system where, you're um just like what we're talking about, like everyone knows the root issues, but it's just the same old. And
Mm-hmm.
in her case, though, it leading to um, mental trauma and, even sexual
Mm-hmm.
abuse or, manipulation that happens with those who are doing ill with their
Mm-hmm.
power. And I mean, we could even bring it into today, today's conversation, which is
Mm-hmm.
I am now seeing so many calls from Taraji P. Henson, and this like goes back to Monique, the comedian, but
Mm-hmm.
like saying that, as Black women, they're not getting paid fairly.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow, um, them calling out Oprah Winfrey and Tyler Perry and like saying, the issue is when you think that there are those around you, which is why I think we take it to heart, Mary. Like,
Mm-hmm.
because I do have so many LGBTQ guests on, like, I feel
Mm-hmm.
it's my duty and responsibility to um, not have them be thrown to the wolves. So, like, if there's any critiques, they can come my way. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
going to. I want every guest here to be treated fairly and
Yeah.
in an equitable way, even if we don't agree with their opinions, which is like the
Mm-hmm.
whole purpose of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And,
Right.
what you're doing, shedding light on true crime, is we're not always going to agree with every talking point, but like
Mm-hmm.
that's the purpose of this type of debate and discussion. And you do it in a healthy way. And I'm looking back, our first episode in the new year of 2023 was with our friend Taylor Ferber from Cancel Me Baby. And it was about, um, being a sexy journalist, and you can hold both aspects of being sexy and being intelligent. And if
Mm-hmm.
no one's listened to that, it was such a great discussion about um being steamy and sexual and also being taken
Exactly.
seriously. And I feel like we're still kind of stuck in that loop of you can be sexy and intellectual, and you shouldn't feel that you need to sacrifice aspects of, you know, yourself and authenticity to appease corporate culture. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Because also with corporate culture, you feel like your identity is being completely stripped in order to fit in to this little box that they want you to have, and you really don't get to pull out your personality. So, such a refreshing conversation to have.
Exactly. So I just want to go through. I mean, I don't think we can hit every episode, but I'm just going to read some of the episodes from 2023.
Mhm.
I'm going to try to get through as many as possible, but I know we might not necessarily remember every detailed conversation, but just like one sentence of to shout out the guests and maybe a takeaway we had from it. So, right, Mary, like if there's something from one of these ITBR episodes, feel free to shout it out. And the same thing for True Crime and Academia. But again, there was a lot that we did. So
Mhm.
let's see.
So
This
much.
is this is like a game. Let's see how much we can do in 20 minutes. Okay. So we already talked about Taylor, check. Um, Lev Rosen, the young adult author, came on to talk about Lavender House.
Love.
Um, and it's called There's All This Queer History That Queer People Don't Know About. Unerasing Queer Noir Literary History. What I remember is how groundbreaking that novel is because it was one of his first adult novels, and
Hmm.
he's known as a young adult novelist. And it really has this like um murder mystery a la Knives Out meets Clue meets a Hitchcockian whodunit.
Hmm.
So that's what I remember. It's very, very in like his novel was just thrilling and that
Hmm.
conversation. Um, okay. Kelly Ford, same kind of like what I love is when we do this year in review, Mary, we just are going to start to see these patterns of what's
Hmm.
been happening in our own lives, like why we were so interested in these conversations. When your character confesses to murder, oh, this was Kelly Ford's real bad things. And not only is she from Arkansas as a queer female writer, which I thought was fascinating,
Hmm.
for her to bring that experience, but also her character confesses to murder in the first chapter. And that was just groundbreaking for me. I'm
Hmm.
like there's no ifs, ands, or betweens about whether this person did it or not, but like what's gonna happen after someone already confessed to murder? Like,
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by stories that put, and it sounds like it's not necessarily the cart before the horse necessarily, but it's that idea that this should be at the end. So it's almost like the viewer, we're so used to having something be explained to us from A to B to C all the way to Z. Now, this
yes.
one's going from Z to Y to X all the way up, to A. So, I just think it's always interesting and jarring when they do that, but I think it adds more. I feel like some people think maybe it takes away, but I think it adds more.
Yeah, well, and you're right. It's going against the climactic narrative conceit, like how a
Mm-hmm.
novel, when right, you have an MFA, Mary, like
Mm-hmm.
everything you're taught not to do, which is to give everything, to give the spoilers
Mm-hmm.
up front. So an amazing episode.
Mm-hmm.
The history of the lobotomy. Do you remember that,
Oh
Mary?
yes. Oh yes. It's a very, very that was a Patreon episode. So on the actual Spotify, Apple catalog, you will only get a couple minutes of it. But yeah, the history of just mental illness and and trying to understand it and is just beyond. But I think one of the most horrific treatments to come out of all of this was the lobotomy. Some people might say electric shock therapy, but actually that's still used today. Pretty sure the lobotomy is not, or at least it's been modified to be safer. So, and more precise.
Yes. Yes. And our one sentences might be run-on sentences, but don't judge us, everyone. Uh the murder of Anita
Kutzton?
Knutson? Yes.
Yeah. Oh, man. No, I always try to remember, like, I always know the names, but then I sometimes forget the stories behind them. But I do remember her, sort of.
Oh, I'll
And
read
I
the
just come up
description.
to it.
It
Thank
says
you.
this week we are discussing a once cold case that has recently turned red hot. We are diving into the murder of Minot State University freshman. Um,
Yes.
and there were all these recent what I love about Mary's true
Mm-hmm.
crime episodes is you always include articles at the end in our show notes.
Mm-hmm.
So like make
I
sure
always
if
show
you're
my
not,
work. I
yeah,
hate
make
math,
sure if
but
you
I will
don't
always
see
show
her,
my work.
yeah, if you don't know that Mary has all these sources, now you know, and you can like deep dive one of these episodes with Mary.
Yeah, I'm not just
But
pulling
okay,
things out of my ass. I am really deep
yeah.
diving research.
And there's a lot of like recent Dateline um
I think,
articles that you had about it, and it was in
mhm.
North Dakota.
Yeah, and I think this one had like a something with DNA was involved. Like
Mm.
basically someone I think he was like related to almost like the Golden State Killer did one of those like 23andMe type of things and realized that this DNA matched an old cold case of poor Anita Coodston. So,
Well, so listen for more. Rochelle Weinstein. Oh, I loved this conversation. First, she lives in Miami, which, like, as Mary knows, I haven't been to Miami yet, but um, I want to go with my boyfriend, and I'm like, I could feel like that Real Housewives of Miami, just like
yes,
the way they do the aesthetic. I could feel it when I
Miami
was
hot
talking
hot.
with Rochelle, like the brightness and cheeriness. But yeah, Rochelle is known as a women's literature writer, but like what I got from our conversation is that when you're considered a romance writer, it can pigeonhole you really as only writing for women. And from what I gathered with Rochelle and what we talked about is how much of her novel writing is not just amplifying women's lives, which it is, but how realistic romance is as a genre. So, I always like to defy the boundaries of what it means to
Mm-hmm.
be pigeonholed as a writer. So, listen to that. Rochelle was awesome. And she has a new book out too. So make sure you look up Rochelle Weinstein. Oh, Dr. Jake Newsome, yes. Um, talked about the pink triangle being used in concentration camps. And I mean, I feel like if ever we're in need of knowledge about the Holocaust, we really need to learn more about um, the aspects of those who were also queer, who were persecuted in the concentration camps and who were disabled and who didn't politically agree with the Nazi party. They were then silenced and, put
Mm-hmm.
away and murdered. I mean, it's awful. And the
Mm-hmm.
Jewish community, of course.
Of course.
So Dr. Jake Newsome, uh, talked about how the pink triangle though was taken back by the queer community and now is even seen in gay bars. So that was an
Hmm.
interesting conversation. Zach Topping um, is an army veteran and he wrote a war novel um, called Wake of War, and it's dystopian. And he also like Mary did this amazing journey with me of it doesn't happen a lot, but myself as a civilian, and he's an army veteran, and he answered all the questions I had about misconceptions we have in the
Mm-hmm.
public as what it means to be a patriot and being a veteran, and like how so many veterans now are in need of medical and mental health
Mm-hmm.
treatment and they're not getting it. And he also answered like my um, gay male fantasy questions, which I had to get to them,
Gotta have that.
Gotta have that. This is also before I had a boyfriend, everyone. So there is an arc before I had a boyfriend and after I have a boyfriend. And also
Let's see
before
if
I
you
got
notice.
yes, and also before I got my PhD and then after I got my PhD.
Yeah.
Um, oh, the Night Stalker. Do you remember the Night Stalker, Mary?
Yes, that is a Richard Ramirez. That was a Patreon episode. So if you are a patron, if you're not a patron, then you should become one so you can listen to that because he's a big one. A lot of people know about him.
Yes, yes. And then Andrea Del Vesco was your Death in the Dorm series. Oh, it
Yeah.
was
So
the
actually,
ABC Hulu
uh-huh.
show.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for the next couple of episodes, I did that whole Death in the Dorm series, and went over all of those cases. So for those of you, I mean, please don't come for me, Hulu. But if you don't have it and want to watch it or can't find it, you can listen to my episodes and get the information there. Um, and I also give you the episode number. So if you're looking for a specific one or if you want to learn more about one and watch it, Just check. I'll give you the episode numbers are in the show notes.
Oh, good. Oh, and then someone you're all going to hear from soon is Dr. Jeffrey Weinstock, who is a pop culture and a Gothic scholar, specifically 19th century. He's coming back on everyone to talk about the fall of the House of Usher. So get ready.
Booyah.
If you haven't seen the fall of the House of Usher, please watch it.
What are you
And I have
doing?
like, yeah, and I have a friend of mine who's a creative writer, James, coming on with him. So we've already recorded it. I know it's exciting. And that's the thing, Mary. Like when I have all these episodes recorded, I just can't wait to release them because I know how exciting the conversations are. But I also have to do my job and hold things, so I'm not in panic mode. Okay. But yeah, he talked about like the horror, gothic literature, pop culture. If you're a Rocky Horror Picture Show fan, he talks a lot
Mm.
about his love of the Rocky Horror Show. So that was a good one. Yeah, like Mary said, the rest are her episodes were Death in the Dorm. So, I'll go back to you, Mary, after the Death in the Dorm series.
Of course.
Then we were joined with Auntie E, Ebony K. Williams, JD. Um, Ebony talked about being on the Real Housewives of New York. What was it like being the first Black housewife in New York? Now she has a TV judge show. So congratulations, Ebony.
Whoop whoop.
Ebony, I always love reaching out to her. She's a mentor of mine. Just a vanguard of media. I don't know how else to encapsulate her brilliance, but she's
She's a
brilliant.
queen.
She is a
Like a
queen.
true
She's not only an
queen.
auntie, she's Queen Ebony.
Yes.
Um, so that was a great conversation. Oh, then Carrie the musical. There was a lot of Carrie the
Love.
musical love this year. So Eric, who did the Carrie musical master cut on YouTube, which is free, so you
Mhm.
could watch it. And then I had the author, of a Carrie the musical book. So we'll get to that when it comes up, but that happened this fall. Death in the Dorm. Okay. Um, Men having sex with men in 19th century England. That was very spicy with the scholar Dr. Chuck Upchurch. He talked about
Spicy, spicy.
sodomy laws. Very spicy, Mary. Um, yep, more Carrie love. Oh, wait, Jesus had a bulge. That was about
Love.
that. Yes,
Love.
that quote came from Dr. Dominic Janes, who is also a 19th century scholar. You're going to sense a theme, everyone. But he talked about like visual art and illustrations, and there's like artists in the 19th century who draw Jesus with a bulge, and it's like very interesting.
Yeah.
Um, but if you're a fashion lover, we talk a lot about queer fashion.
Mm.
Oh, then you talked about Rodney Alcala,
Alcala.
the dating game killer, which is a Patreon
Yeah.
episode.
He's another bigger one. I wouldn't say he's as big as Richard Ramirez, but a lot of people do know him. They give him the name the dating game killer because he was on the show The Dating Game. And he actually did win and was able to go on this date with the woman. For anyone who doesn't know the dating game, it's a woman and there are three dudes that are on the other side of this little wall, and she's got to ask them questions, and based off of that she picks who she wants to go on the date with. And he got picked, and she even said that after like the portion of the date that was filmed for the show was over, they were supposed to go on another like little like dinner, just the two of them or something. She refused because she got the heebie jeebies from this guy. And rightfully so, because even I think at that time he was killing people. So, you know, her intuition was right. Who knows if she would have been a victim after that? But, thankfully she made it out.
Well, and then your next episode was with Bruce Goldfarb, the writer,
Mm-hmm.
chief medical examiner, former
Assistant.
executive
Mm-hmm.
assistant to the
Yes.
chief medical
Mm-hmm.
examiner of Maryland. And I know you always recommend his book to me. It's 18 Tiny Deaths, right, Mary?
Yes. And then for this one, we actually interviewed him for his book about um called ON or OCME, Life in America's Top Forensic Medical Center, because it's about his experience having worked in the medical examiner's office, being like Andrew said, the executive assistant, meaning the highest up assistant to the medical examiner. He talks about a lot of his experiences working there, not only just running the oh my gosh, the name just went out of my head, but it's the exhibit that the 18 Tiny Deaths is
Mm.
you know, held, and he runs that, or did run that, essentially, like tours and maintenance and things like that. But then
Mm,
also in like during the times of the pandemic when there were certain issues, like I forget which one specifically, I don't think it was George Floyd. There was another murder though that he specifically talks about in the protests that were happening out front of the medical examiner's office. And really just being that person who's like, look, I just work, like literally he's like, for him, that was the definition of, look, I just work here. But he
mhm.
really did care and wanted to help. So it's
Yeah.
very insightful, gives you, such an insight into how that works, and also some of the misconceptions. So, for example, one real quick that I'm going to mention in this long run on sentence that I have, is that, for example, you could, in the state of Maryland, you could go and pick a body. You don't have to be related to that person. If that's John Doe and no one's picking them up and it's not involved in a murder, you can just take them and, like strap it to the hood of your car or the top of your car and go off. And that's totally legal. So things like that get unearthed. And I think it's just a really interesting conversation that you all should listen to.
Yeah. Well, I know I said we'd be quick, Mary, but is it okay if we keep going?
Yeah, let's keep going.
Okay. Okay. So everyone's getting a treat here. Because we're just gonna keep recapping these episodes. But the Bad Gays episode, Ben Miller, I met him at the Queer History Conference in San Francisco, and he talks about like who are like his top bad gays in history. So that was fun. Um, we got Dr. Lena Haji and Dr. John De La Torre. We already talked about
Which you
them.
talked about.
Yep. Dr. Vernon Rosario, he discussed um like the medical field and their approach to pathologizing homosexuality. That was a gay and lesbian review episode. We have another Death in the Dorm series. Um, Karen Coonrod is a professor at Yale for theater. So if you're a theater lover, she talked all about like her directing approach, Shakespeare adaptations, and she put on this really amazing production in Italy of Merchant in is it the Merchant in Venice? The
Yes.
Merchant in Venice. Yeah. Um, or is it the Merchant of Venice? I always forget.
In.
In Venice. Okay, thank you. So yeah, she put that production right in Venice and in the shtetl, like where the Jewish community was. So that was
Mm.
really interesting when she described that process. Um, then we had Marianne Williamson on, who is still running as a candidate for president. So that was insightful and talk about holding people's feet to the fire. So that's what I'll say about that because you should listen to it. Um, Matt Baum came on, who runs this amazing YouTube channel all about queer TV and film. And he talked about, you know, why certain TV and shows really just captivate a queer audience. Like, why do we still return to Will and Grace, for example? Um, then you had the Iceman,
Mm-hmm.
Mary.
Which is the story of Polish hitman for the Italian mafia, Richard Kuklinski.
Okay.
Again, if you're a
Um,
patron, you can listen to the whole thing for free. Or
yes,
not for
you need
free,
to
but you
join our.
pay us. So,
Oh, and you can join our Patreon for 1 week for free as a trial. So make sure you do that. Um, then I had Jarrett on, who I actually, Mary and I met in Main Stage for summer theater camp. I was in production of Godspell and Smokey Joe's Cafe with Jarrett, directed by Renee Chambers Lisiaga, who's been on the podcast before too. Um, so he talked about like being a poet, and he like what I love is on his Instagram and TikTok, Mary, he'll like be in Philly and just like improvise a poem, and it's like on the
I love
streets of
it.
Philly and or on the bus. So he's an artist in motion.
Love.
Yep, Dr. Mark Stein, he talked about queer public history and like seeing what queer studies, how it's now gone through all these different iterations from the 90s to today. And then Dr. Ramsey Fawaz, who's a good friend of mine now, he also came on to discuss Barbie and the
Mm-hmm.
queer aspects of Barbie. But here he was talking about like why would the public care about queer and feminist studies? Um, Yep. Okay. So then Mary had an episode. Oh, yes, I remember. This was one that took place in India.
Yes, the
Uh,
murder of Nikit Kumar. Yeah, sadly, it was a younger child, not super young, but like not in college. They called that level of education college. There was a whole caste that that there's not supposed to be segregated or you know um discriminated against for, but this child technically was and was beaten to death by his teacher. Thankfully, he was able to survive a little bit, but sadly, he did die in the hospital because of these injuries. So it's a sad
well,
one. I mean,
changing the
they're all
topic.
sad, let's be honest.
Yeah, well,
Everyone
changing
dies
the
in mine. So
yeah, no, everyone like almost dies in your episodes. Well, someone who sadly has passed away, but the legend Madeline Kahn, I had William V. Madison
yes.
on who wrote her bio. And, if you're Madeline Kahn, like if you've even just seen her in Clue, which almost everyone has, or Blazing Saddles, she there's so much to her life that he dug into. So that was fascinating. Um, what is it like being gay in the deep south? That was the next episode with Eric Solomon and Marty Paget, who both have their PhD and they're good friends of mine. And then Mary had the murder of Gravel.
Gravel.
Oh, Gravel from Salem State University. She was a
Mhm.
computer science major.
Yeah, she
Ooh.
went missing and her body was found a few days later on not like the side of the road, but a couple workmen found her body not too far from the one main road there. And it sadly went cold, but then recently, it's another recent one where thankfully advances in technology and things like that were able to help put a suspect in custody.
Yeah. Well, and then like jumping through, I had another theater conversation with Michael Kushner, who like has been a Broadway like in producing and is a photographer. So that was really interesting. My Policeman, which has Harry Styles in the movie. If you haven't seen it, it's
Mhm.
excellent. I had the author of My Policeman on with the author Beth Ann Roberts, and one of our interns from the spring was on that episode, Andrea. So loved
Yeah.
that Andrea came on that show. She's a Harry Styles stan. Um, and then there was the Estee Lauder story about Fifth Avenue Glamour Girl, like how Estee Lauder built her brand from the department store up. So
Mhm.
that was with Renee Rosen, who she's now working on a novel about the founder of Barbie, Ruth Handler, which I think is actually going to come out soon. So, and then Mary had more Patreon episodes about the murders of Lacey and Connor Peterson. Um,
Connor Peterson is the unborn child that Lacey was carrying. If there's another name that might ring a bell for this case, it might be Scott Peterson because everyone knows that one. So, I mean, Dean Cain played him in a Lifetime film. We know.
oh my God. Well, and then you had the Darius Miles case.
Yes, and that is from my recollection, I do remember a little bit. It seemed that there was some sort of issue with someone named Jamia Harris who sadly was murdered and it's just one of those you make a rash decision and Darius Miles now has to face the consequences of his actions. And, it's a shame because not only did Jamia Harris lose their life, but also you have Darius Miles, who was a junior and a star forward, I believe, on the University of Alabama's basketball team. So you have someone who did have promise and make this terrible decision, and then thus ending someone else's life who knows what they could have done in the world. So,
It's awful.
you know, it's all
Yeah, but
horrible.
it should, yeah, you covered a lot of the ethics and morality around that. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the next two were musical or not musical, but theater, New York City based ones. I had Christina Durarte, who is known as an actor's director. Like she's an actress, but like approaches her directing just knowing that psychological insight of how an actor would want to be directed. And we talked a lot about method acting since she trained at the
Mm-hmm.
actor studio, which is actually where Marilyn Monroe trained.
Yeah, yeah.
So then the next one was about um musicals and how they changed the world, which was fascinating. And David Armstrong was actually the director of Hairspray in Seattle when it premiered. So before it went to Broadway. And of course, I had to ask him all about Hairspray and my love of it. Then Mary had the case of Jean Isaac Stees, the killer professor.
Yes. Yes. He savagely killed his pregnant wife because of a love triangle he was in. My memory serves me correct. It definitely seemed like he was one of those guys who found a new relationship and realized, well, I don't have to be married or have a kid. I can just do this. And then, you know.
Well, and then very different than the killer professor. I had he's not a professor, but I'll call him a professor, Zachary Zane, of being a greedy male bisexual and owning it. And talking about orgies and like how he does all of this investigative journalism on the ground at these sex parties. So yeah, that
Love.
was talk about steamy. Then I talked about Whitman and queer studies, and that was because my article had just come out
Mm-hmm.
on Walt Whitman and queer theory, which you can read for free in my link tree. Okay, and that was with Jack Parlett, who wrote a book about Fire Island, and he is an academic who loves all things Whitman um, and cruising studies, and I've used him in my dissertation. So then I remember listening to Grooming in the Dance World, Mary's Dusty
Mm-hmm.
and Mitchell
So this
Button. That
is
was disturbing.
still alleged. As far as I know, there like charges and like, there hasn't been a trial yet. But there are two people specifically in the dance world, Dusty and Michael Button. They're a married couple. Um, Michael was a dancer and turned choreographer, teacher, sort of a thing, and Dusty was a professional, like, and a principal dancer with one of like the best ballet companies in the world. And they are being charged with and being accused of grooming some of their students. So, you know,
Mm.
wonderful.
Well, and Tchaikovsky, um, uh, wait,
You
no, no,
mean
no, no, no.
Balanchine?
Sorry, Balanchine. Why? I was like, wait, not Tchaikovsky. Sorry, Tchaikovsky. He created he composed the
He composed
Nutcracker
the music,
and the
Balanchine
Sleeping Beauty,
choreographed.
but sorry, not him. But yeah, Balanchine. Like also, there was this whole. I remember, um, podcast series that had come out like right when this episode of yours came out, Mary. It was called like
Mm-hmm.
Turning, a
Mm-hmm.
wall of mirrors. I'm pretty sure, and it was about like George Balanchine. Yeah,
Yeah, he was
Whew.
yeah. They
He
tried
was a
not to talk
groomer.
too much about it. I remember when I was studying, that like him, like dance and him specifically in college. But you could tell you were like, this dude, he did great for the dance world, but he was a shitty human being.
Not all artists are compassionate.
No,
Uh,
they're not all artists are as great as the work that they create.
yeah, there's a lot of horror stories from some of these
Mm-hmm.
artists. Okay, then oh yeah, sound writing. This was with doctors Tanya K. Rodriguez and Kyle Stedman, and it was part of Broadview Press, which I love when I have Broadview Press guests on. And they were like talking about how they use podcasts in the classroom. So that's something that I know Mary and I are going to be talking a lot about at the MLA conference. It's so interesting when you have your students start to create podcasts. Feminism in the 21st century. Wow, I remember I talked about Paris Hilton and like, do we consider her a feminist? That was with Dr. Alex Ketchum. And we would go through all the different waves of feminism, Mary. And does that still stand? Like, where is feminism
Mm,
now in 2023? And I think that's a very contested issue. So,
yeah.
yeah. And then we went for a summer break because I was getting my dissertation ready.
Yeah.
So I remember that time. And then I released my dissertation
Mhm.
presentation for you all to listen to. Mary came back on with the disappearance of Brandon Swanson. Do you remember that,
Yes,
Mary?
he went missing the last day of classes in the winter, so like first semester. Um, he had called home to let them know that like basically from what I remember, he took a different way home than he should, that he normally would have. And it seemed like his car became stranded and he went to walk, I guess, to get help. And that was the last, no one has seen him since the phone disconnected when he was on with his parents. And I think the last thing he was heard was saying, it was like, oh shit. And then that was it.
Oh
He
wow.
hasn't been seen to this day.
Oh my. That
So
is disturbing. Um, I was gonna say every time Mary,
I know
like,
I'm such a ray of
I hear your
sunshine.
like, and I hear your episodes, and then I realize that this is not going to be uplifting, but it always teaches you a lesson, which I always like. What true crime is so good at doing is us learning about um the human psyche and trying to, you know, improve upon our justice system or mental
Mhm.
health and, you know, being there for each other. We need
Mhm.
to come together.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I had Tom Cruise, the novelist of The New Life, and it's a historical fiction novel about John Addington Symonds, who created the term homosexuality with Havelock Ellis. And
Mhm.
I quote him a lot in my dissertation. And then I just remember there's this line where he says in the novel, poem was Whitman's word for a man's cock. And I spent a lot of time dissecting that in the episode. Um,
Love.
and then you
If
had,
that is true,
yeah,
I love that for him. I
well,
love
and
that
then
for him.
you had a good friend of ours, Christian Garcia, who we're going to see a
Yes.
lot on the podcast, um,
Yes.
talk about poisonous women. So you remember
Mhm.
something from that episode, Mary?
Yeah, we were drawing a lot of parallels from fairy tales and true life poisonings and how some of them inspired certain fairy tale stories. So that was really fun. Also, we discussed how mainly women are the one who would use poison. Not to say that that's the rule,
Hmm.
but that is a very common thread amongst people who murder via poison versus murder via other methods. So, very great conversation.
Oh, good. Yes. And also, like, you go through the Disney villains because Christian
Mhm.
is like we are obsessed with Disney villains.
Yes.
And like you try to determine who was the most masterful poisoner.
Mm-hmm.
So then I had on this discussion about sports. This was in August, so like, we were on the beach and oh, I'm excited to be back there on the beach. And it was about like the roots of athletic culture, which goes back to ancient Greece. And it's like this whole discussion about how the philosophers, like it was this mind body connection. So that was fascinating. Then I remember this because of the real life Scream
Mm-hmm.
connection. You had the murder of Casey Joe Stoddard.
Yes, poor Casey Joe Stoddard was house sitting for family at the time, and two friends of, well, acquaintances, I guess, friends of her boyfriend, not really sure. Not the boyfriend had anything to do with it, but because I know people ask. But these two
Yeah.
friends had just seen Scream. One of them seemed to be more obsessed with it than the other. The other one kind of seemed like a tag along, but together they were collectively obsessed and decided that they were going to kill Cassie via Scream style. So, and it's
Mm,
unfortunate because she did everything right. She heard the strange noise coming from the basement and she didn't go in the basement. She should have survived, in my
yeah.
opinion, if we're playing by horror film rules.
But
So,
unfortunately,
yeah, they
um,
were impatient.
horror movies don't mimic real life
Yeah,
scenarios.
because
Yeah.
like I said,
Even
people
though
get
they were
impatient.
trying, yeah, and they were trying to, yeah, it's very disturbing, but a must listen. If you want to know the, behind the scenes of how Scream, they were actually borrowing from
Mm-hmm.
um, a real
Because this
life
was
case.
just after it came out too.
Oh, so just after Scream came out, yeah, they were so inspired by the movie Scream that they were mimicking the narrative.
Mm-hmm. They're trying to make art life.
Yes. Oh, but we haven't gotten to this episode yet, but um we covered Scream. Like we actually watched the full movie in October, and I had on Lawrence, who's my boyfriend. We talked about how the movie Scream was actually based off of a murder too. So
Mm-hmm.
okay. Then I had on the golden age of gay pornography, looking at like all these different movies that had come out. With He's just such a well-known scholar of queer male erotic cinema. His name is Dr. Thomas Woe, and that was amazing to talk about. And he actually was living in New York City getting his PhD when he was going to gay porn cinemas. So yeah, try to like think about Mary what that would have looked like. in the 1970s was fascinating. Um, and then I got my birth chart read by my friend Sarah Slotnick. That was very fun. If you want to get your birth chart read, you should check her out. Um, Dr. Tim Dean came on to talk about, um, well, again, gay male porn. That was a theme in August. And I also had included them in my dissertation. But we talked about Treasure Island Media, which is like known for very hardcore gay pornography. So let's just say his book, Mary, was widely um, talked about, but also there was a lot of eyebrow raising going on when it came out. Because they're like men not having condoms. And, you know, there was a lot of shame around the topic of his book. Um, then I talked about what happens after you get a PhD, which now I can say you become an entrepreneur and create, you have your own small business. So things do work for you. And then Mary talked about the disappearance of Paula Jean Weldon. Yeah. Oh, wait. I think and Mary's muted. So she is going to unmute herself.
I don't even know how I did that. My mouse must have been hovering over the microphone for some reason.
Oh,
Um, poor Paula Jean Weldon, she went for a hike in Vermont near Bennington College, which was where she was going, and no one has seen her since.
wow. Again, like a cold case.
Yeah, and there's really barely any evidence to suggest if like she fell or anything. Like they haven't even found her body. So, just really sad.
It's just wild, like how many of these people you cover that they've never been seen again. And you just wonder, like, where are they? Are they
Mm-hmm.
like, could they actually be still alive?
Yeah.
And like living in an alias situation.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Or like get
Um,
some sort of amnesia, don't remember who they are, have to build a whole new life for themselves and then have no idea that they were ever this other person.
mm,
I mean, it's rare, but that does happen.
yeah. Then I had Joseph Federico come on for the first time, and we discussed um his coming out journey. But then he came on in October recently and talked about American Horror Story Coven and like gay vampires. And he's a writer and he's so inspired by New Orleans. And like all these episodes, Mary, like if I've never been to the city, it makes me always want to go there. I'm like, I want
Mm-hmm.
to go to New Orleans. Then you talked about Mary, the murder of Mark Kilroy, who it was a cult murder. So that kind of like ties
Yes.
into cult thinking.
Yeah, he was on vacation with some friends. They got separated. They thought he left, went back to the hotel. He was taken by the local cult. I forget the exact name of it, and they sacrificed him. So
Oh my gosh. Well, my
it's
next
pretty graphic.
episode,
So, be careful with
yeah, my
that one.
next episode was with writer Stuart Barnes from Australia. And like I really dug into, you know, have you ever thought to yourself, I think I could be a poet? And then like, how do you claim that you're a poet? Like just owning, oh, I am a poet. Like it is, you know, not an occupation that a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
uh claim and own. So that was such an exciting conversation. And how he also puts voice to animals or artificial intelligence in his
Mm-hmm.
poetry. I always like wonder how people, tap into animal thinking as
Yeah.
writers. Um, then I had one of my like Kane University professors come on, Dr. John Colin Gruser, who's also a Poe scholar, and he talked about what do you do with a PhD in English, and we just faced the reality of how there's like no positions opening up in academia and like how people are pivoting. And it's also creating a lot of new pathways. So it's not all doom and gloom, even though it feels very frightening. Um, my Hot Boy Summer, we don't really, you could listen to that, but I like recapped, going back to Fire Island and that was like a very interesting experience. But then my boyfriend met me there, and then, eventually
Aw.
I decided I would be monogamous and settle down. So then you talked about Patty Hearst. Yeah, that
Yeah,
kidnapping.
that was a couple
Wild.
parter. Um, I mean, I'm sure most of you know, but Patty Hearst is the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the huge newspaper mogul. She was kidnapped by a terrorist organization, a very small one. Not that that makes it any better, but not like it wasn't dealing with ISIS, is what I'm trying to say. Um, but she had been kidnapped and, had been tortured and assaulted and eventually, which what sometimes happens, is that she started adopting their beliefs more as a way of survival. And then it eventually became her way of life. And she wound up becoming involved in one of their attacks. So it was a very controversial case because at the time, the notion of Stockholm syndrome hadn't, like, that term hadn't even been coined yet. They had just, like, that actual incident in Stockholm had just occurred, like,
Mm,
recently within this time frame. So, they weren't lenient with her. Instead, they charged her for all these crimes and she went to jail, even though technically, she had been brainwashed and forced into doing so.
mm. Well, and interestingly, my episode that came out right after that was 22 years it had been since 9/11. And
Mm-hmm.
Rachel, you could tell, sadly lost her
Mm-hmm.
fiance in the World Trade Center. And she explained like the process of trauma, like how she's still working her way through it, and rebuilding herself. And like, what does it mean to be misunderstood? So that was
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. Um, Yep. And then you talked more about Patty Hearst. Then I talked about Hunks, Heartthrobs, and Desiring Men with Manuel Betancourt, who had come out with this book that I just love called The Male Gazed. And like, what does it mean to like not be like a man gazing at women, but a man gazing at other men? And like, what does that
Mm-hmm.
mean in all these different circumstances? So he's also a recovering academic who has a PhD. I was about to say a recovering alcoholic, and I'm like, no, that's not what I mean. Um,
No.
and then I was like, recovering academic, Andrew. Manuel, though, that was an amazing conversation. Then I had Eric Marcus on about, he's from Making Gay History, the podcast, and he talked about like LGBTQ civil rights. Then I had Dr. Andrew Lear on from the Gay and Lesbian Review, who talked about ancient Greek society, male love, like from ancient Greek society to the current day. Um, and then um, I had another Carrie the Musical episode, and that was with Chris Adams, who has the podcast Out for Blood, and he just wrote this whole cultural history of Carrie the Musical. We talked a lot about Stephen King and the movie version because Betty Buckley, who is a friend of the show, hi Betty, she was in the movie version as the gym teacher, and then she was the mother in Carrie the Musical on Broadway. So then we started our ITBR rewatches series with Queer as Folk. So Christian was the first guest on that. So if you haven't listened to all the Queer as Folk episodes, you should and watch the show.
Mm-hmm.
Then Mary had the murder of Betty Shanks. Oh,
Yes, this is
Australia. There's an Australia
Australia's.
connection. There
Yeah,
we
it's
go.
their most notorious unsolved murder. Sadly, Betty was walking home at night from hanging out with friends and she was attacked and murdered. Like, literally not that far from her house too, which just sucks. And of course, she was considered missing and then they found her and sadly they still don't know who did it.
Oh God. Well, then I had a discussion about is the Barbie movie feminist with Sheena Rubino, who is a doula. She's trained as a doula and is a yogi. And that was just interesting to like get her take on the womb theory. Yeah, she kept talking about womb theory and like how gynecology appears at the end. So that happened. Then I had an Australian writer, another one, Nigel Featherstone, who talked about queer men writing with their cocks. And I don't mean like physically writing with their cocks, which
That
could
would
be like
be
that.
quite
Remember
impressive.
there was like the puppetry of the penis people. It wasn't like that. Um, so that was a really great conversation. My mom came on for the first time to talk about A Haunting in Venice, which spoiler alert, we're not rewatching again. So but it was a good, she was very honest in her critique of it. So you should listen. Sarah Fraser came on to talk about the writer's strike, which now thankfully they reached a resolution. Bethany Frankel's Reality Reckoning, which is still going on. Mary talked about the disappearance of Mara Murray, who is still
Yes.
missing after
Yes,
19 years.
she's still missing. Similar to Brandon, it was wintertime. She got into a car accident. Her car went off a ditch Two people who lived nearby did see it happen and called the police. One actually went to help her, but then, um, and offered more help, but then was like, hold on, let me go call. By the time the police showed up, she was missing and just gone, disappeared. And they still haven't found her.
Hmm. Well, then I had Samya Krishnamurthy on to talk about hip hop and fashion and like why would Anna Wintour now embrace um Kanye West's line? I mean, now she's not embracing Kanye West with his controversies, but she did at one time. Then P. Diddy, how has Kim Kardashian always been at the Met Gala? So that was really fun. Matt Scalarod came on to the Queer as Folk podcast. Um, and he has this show called I Love Gay Today. So that was a great conversation. Are You the Gay Best Friend? I remember doing this whole game with Nicholas DiDomizio, who wrote that novel, and like talked about the clueless gay best friend and Degrassi. Um, Loved that conversation. Then Aaron Hamburger came on to talk about how he found his photo of his grandmother in male drag, and like that caused this impetus for writing Hotel Cuba about Jewish immigration. Um, and then I launched with, well, Christian launched because that's his show, the Smash Rewatch show, which Mary was a guest on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's all about them putting on the Marilyn Monroe musical. And then, Mary, you had an episode about the University of Texas Tower shooting.
Yes, so that happened in 1966, and this is something that um happens, I feel like, very rarely in the true crime world, where unfortunately Charles Whitman, had the shooter, had a tumor in his brain, and where it was located, they have deduced that it was pushing on the part of your decision making and your impulsivity. So they truly believe that this tumor is what caused him to go out and commit this mass shooting back in 1966. And it's just overall just sad because even from it's not like it just happened one day. Like he knew something was wrong and he kept trying to get help. And unfortunately, in 1966, they just didn't have the resources like we do today.
Mm. Well, then there was the Scream rewatch, which I talked about. Then I had on Sage Catugno, who they just wrote this graphic novel called The Glass Scientist, and it's all inspired by Jekyll and Hyde. So our first graphic novelist came on the show, and we talked about Victorian Gothic monsters and reviewed the movie Talk to Me, which if you haven't seen Talk to Me, and I keep telling Mary she needs to
And
see
now
it,
I
but
need to
oh my
see it.
God, it was wild. One of the most like horrifying movies I've seen. Um, Aaron Wallace came on to the Queer as Folk show. Then Mary came on with Lindsay, the housewife historian. We love
Mm-hmm.
Lindsay. And we talked all about like the real housewife shows and just our honest opinions. Um, And then Mary came back on with Janine from the Soapbox and why, and we talked about The Conjuring, The Exorcist. Um, yeah, that was just so the demonic
Great one.
possession was fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, our Halloween was on fire. Just
Exactly.
like I love doing this because I'm like, wow, like you said, we covered a lot of topics.
There's so
Um,
much.
Joseph Federico came back to do the vampires and witches in New Orleans. The Smash Show continues. It's still going on. Then, like Mary talked about, the Virginia Tech shooting discussion happened. Um, Lindsay came back on to talk about Salt Lake City and Orange County Real Housewives. Dr. Ann Sophie Anderson, my friend, talked about becoming an entrepreneur and being a creative person and like not buying into imposter syndrome. Joe Nasta, who's a poet, came on the Queer as Folk show. Um, we talked about reality reckoning with um, my friend. I had on Ronnie Jr. and I talked about BravoCon. So that was really enjoyable. Then I had on BJ Irons to talk about gay Greek mythology, Fire Island, Desperate Housewives. Um, Mary came on the Smash Show. Then a friend of mine, Ariana Pesky, is that? I think that's how you say her last name. Um, I always just call her Ariana, but she came on to talk about fitness and health advice because she's a fitness trainer and an influencer. She's coming back on to do a New Year's resolution show. So,
Mm,
should we buy into New
that'll be
Year's
good.
resolutions? How do we actually like form healthy habits? Don't set yourself up for failure. My calendar just came off to remind me about a spin class tonight, so that's very fitting. Um, then Dr. Shannon Dia came on to talk about gender and sexuality and being going beyond the binary. My parents came on during Thanksgiving to talk about Killers of the Flower Moon. Why are we not taught about Native American history and genocide? That was important. Elizabeth Winder came on to talk about the women behind the Rolling Stones. She wrote a book called Parachute Women. My friend Kevin Gadzelinski came on to talk about Queer as Folk. This was a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Schneider from the Gay and Lesbian Review talked about 30 years of the Gay and Lesbian Review and what they do with that magazine. Rashid Newson, who's the producer um, behind Bel Air, came on to talk about his novel, My Government Means to Kill Me, about young gay Black men and political and social reckoning. Um, Scott Alexander Hess came on to talk about Queer as Folk. And I went to his book signing with my parents, and that's when they actually met my boyfriend, Lawrence Mary.
Mm.
So it all happened with Scott Alexander Hess's
Aw.
book signing of A Season in Delhi. Then you came on to talk about the murder of Kaylee Sawyer.
Yes, she was murdered by a campus security guard. Um, so that actually, her murder led to a lot of bunch of new laws that made sure that anyone in a security guard's position, especially in a school campus situation, that the vetting process would be a lot better than what it was because this guy had priors and he was allowed to be a kid. Like not just like, oh, he stole something, but like he had like domestic violence cases and things like that. So
Like, why is he a school security
exactly, like there's
guard?
no reason.
Yeah. That reminds me, you might have to look into this, Mary, but I'm pretty sure my parents said that when they were at Drexel in the 80s, there was a similar situation. He was like a maintenance employee who murdered
Mm,
a college student.
I'm gonna have to look at that.
You might have to look into that. Yeah. Um, See, everyone, this is how Mary and I come up with ideas. We're just like you're in like our brainstorming workshop. But then I had on Dr. Andrew Israel Ross, and he talked about Marie Antoinette pornography.
Mm-hmm.
And all of like queer Paris. So if you are a Paris fan, a Parisian fan, he talked about like how they were having public sex in the gardens in Paris, which isn't happening now, but they were wild back then
Good
in
for
the
them.
French, revolution. Um then I had on Dr. Lindsay Tuggle, good mentor friend of mine about, you know, can you be a creative writer and an academic? And she says it's a hard balance, but it can work. So she gives a lot of advice. Elizabeth Winder came back to talk about Smash. She's going to come back on, everyone. Mary, then, her last episode before
Mm-hmm.
the break was called La Preuve Murderer. What was
Yeah,
that,
Le
Mary?
Prof. He was a Belgian serial killer and rapist, but he was also a professor, a man named Ronald Jansen. Um, so
Mhm.
yeah.
Oh, gosh. And then I had on Lucy and Childs to talk about queer youth in literature, which is like a very hard um to juggle those discussions. I talked about like how queer youth in literature, we talked about their representation. Mary, I'm sure you remember that novel called A Child Called It,
Yes.
which he's not queer, but like just how
Mm-hmm.
torturous that book is because it's based on the author's
Mm-hmm.
real life story. Um, then Melissa Giberson came on to talk about coming out as a lesbian in her late 40s, and she never really was interested in women before that. And
Mm.
people are fascinated. They're like, well, how did you not know you were into women? And she said, it just wasn't, there was a woman who fell into my life who I just fell in love with and realized that I desired women more than men, even though she was married to a man and had children. So that
Mm-hmm.
was just to see her journey and talk to
Mm-hmm.
her about it was fascinating. And then our last episode was with Travis Roundtree, who came on my Queer as Folk show. So yeah, that is everything we talked about in 2023, Mary. We did
That
it.
is
Oh
our
my
year in
God.
review. Holy shit.
Jesus Christ. In a good way, I'm saying Jesus Christ. So, Mary, I can't wait for 2024. Happy and
Yes.
healthy holidays to everyone. Mary,
Yes.
thanks for doing this discussion. Thanks for
Oh, of
going over
course.
every
Thanks for
episode.
having me.
And I will see you in Philadelphia for the conference.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone. See
Bye,
you in
everyone.
2024.
Yeah.